To many people, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow are remembered as rebellious lovers on the run, young, glamorous, and defiant in the face of the Great Depression. Hollywood films, pop culture, and decades of romantic storytelling have painted them as misunderstood anti-heroes who lived fast and died young. In this video, we strip away the myth and look at 9 truly horrible facts about the most infamous outlaw couple in American history. Details that movies often ignore and legends conveniently forget. Some of these facts may surprise you. Others may change the way you see Bonnie and Clyde forever. Do you think Bonnie and Clyde have been romanticized too much in movies and media? Or do you believe their story still deserves sympathy? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you enjoy deep dives into American outlaw history, dark Old West facts, and the stories history books don't soften, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. The legend is famous, but the truth is far more unsettling. Often described as the most famous and most heavily romanticized criminal pair in American history, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were two young Texans whose actions during the early 1930s left a lasting impression on the American imagination. Emerging during the hardship of the Great Depression, their story quickly became woven into the nation's cultural memory. Over time, their names came to symbolize a stylized vision of the era, one filled with fast cars, bold attitudes, and defiance of authority. Popular imagery often depicts a glamorous world in which social rules were broken with flair, danger carried a certain allure, and life was lived urgently because the future felt uncertain. This image, repeated endlessly in films and media, helped turn Bonnie and Clyde into icons rather than individuals. Yet myth and reality rarely align. The popular narrative suggests a fearless, fashionably dressed couple living freely beyond the reach of law enforcement, enjoying excitement and notoriety as they challenge the established order. In truth, historical records reveal a far less polished existence. Their daily lives were marked by instability, frequent mistakes, constant pressure, and physical hardship rather than comfort or luxury. Bonnie and Clyde, along with the Barrow gang, often struggled with poor planning and limited resources. Rather than a smooth string of successes, their experiences were characterized by uncertainty, failed efforts, and the ongoing need to stay ahead of capture. This reality stands in sharp contrast to the confident image later constructed around them. Their transformation into cultural figures accelerated after photographs of the pair posing with firearms were discovered and circulated. These images, detached from their broader context, helped spark intense public fascination. Media coverage amplified selective details, turning ordinary moments into symbols and gradually reshaping public perception. Although their story ended abruptly, the dramatic nature of that ending only strengthened the legend that followed. The continued popularity of Bonnie and Clyde says less about their actual achievements and more about the enduring power of storytelling, imagery, and media repetition. Bonnie and Clyde became famous. Born into the household of a struggling Texas farmer, Clyde Barrow showed an early and genuine passion for music. As a boy, he loved to sing and often played an aging guitar around the family farm. Largely self-taught, Clyde also learned to play the saxophone, and for a time it appeared that music, not notoriety, might shape his future. That path gradually shifted as he grew older. Influenced by his brother Buck and an unsavory family acquaintance, Clyde's interests slowly moved away from performance and toward unlawful activities, including car theft. Economic hardship, limited opportunity, and poor influences combined to pull him further from the musical life he once imagined. Bonnie Parker shared a similar love for music and performance while growing up in West Texas. As a child, she enjoyed the stage and frequently took part in school programs and talent shows. Bonnie sang popular Broadway numbers as well as country songs, and those who knew her remembered her as confident, bright, and ambitious. She often told friends that one day her name would be widely known. Bonnie was also an enthusiastic moviegoer who dreamed of a future in film. She envisioned herself as a performer, admired glamorous actresses, and imagined success in front of the camera. In a twist of fate, fame did come, but in a form neither Bonnie nor Clyde ever anticipated. Instead of appearing on stage or screen as entertainers, their images were circulated through newsreels, newspapers, and sensational crime magazines. Reports of their activities, frequently exaggerated or inaccurate, spread rapidly, transforming them into public figures. While the attention occasionally fed their egos, it more often complicated their lives, making anonymity nearly impossible and increasing the pressure of constant recognition. Despite everything, neither Clyde nor Bonnie fully abandoned their original dreams. Bonnie's movie magazines were often found among the personal items left behind in abandoned vehicles. Clyde held on to his love of music for as long as circumstances allowed, keeping his guitar with him until it had to be left behind during one of their many narrow escapes. He later asked his mother to inquire whether it could be returned, but the request was denied. Music remained meaningful to Clyde until the very end. Historical accounts note that among the personal belongings recovered after their final encounter was his saxophone, a quiet reminder that beneath the legend and the headlines were two young people whose early aspirations had once pointed toward a very different life. Bonnie and Clyde didn't spend much time robbing banks. Popular films and television programs often depict Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow as relentless bank robbers who targeted financial institutions across the Midwest and the American South. This image, however, greatly exaggerates their actual activities. Historical records show that during the roughly 4 years in which the Barrow Gang operated, they carried out fewer than 15 bank robberies, and several of those involved returning to the same locations. Even when these attempts were successful, the rewards were typically modest. In some cases, the amount taken was surprisingly small, sometimes less than $100, hardly enough to sustain a life on the run. When bank robberies did occur, they were most often carried out by Clyde himself, sometimes with the assistance of his associate Raymond Hamilton. Bonnie's involvement was inconsistent. At times, she served as a driver, but on many occasions, she was not directly involved at all, remaining behind at a temporary hideout while others carried out the robbery. Banks posed significant challenges for the pair. Increased security, public visibility, and the complexity of planning made such targets risky. As a result, when operating independently, Bonnie and Clyde generally avoided bank robberies altogether. Instead, they more frequently turned their attention to small grocery stores and gas stations. These locations were easier to approach, offered quicker exits, and presented fewer obstacles. The trade-off, however, was that the money taken from these robberies was usually minimal. Because the returns were so low, robberies had to be carried out more often simply to cover basic expenses. This increased activity left a larger trail behind them, making it increasingly difficult to remain unnoticed. Over time, the need for constant movement in short-term hiding places became a defining feature of their lives, further separating the reality of their experience from the glamorous image later created by popular media. Bonnie died a married woman, but not to Clyde. It is not widely remembered that Bonnie Parker was married at a very young age. At just 16, she wed Roy Thornton, an attractive classmate she knew while living in Dallas. Given her circumstances, the decision did not seem difficult. Bonnie's father had passed away, her mother worked long hours in a factory, and Bonnie herself faced limited opportunities, with service work appearing to be her most likely future. Marriage offered the promise of stability and escape. That promise did not last long. The relationship quickly deteriorated. Bonnie later reflected that her husband was unreliable and unfaithful, describing him as someone who was rarely present and emotionally distant even when he returned home. Thornton frequently disappeared for extended periods, and when he did reappear, his behavior further strained the marriage. As a result, Bonnie often stayed with her mother rather than at home. Over time, Thornton's involvement in criminal schemes caught up with him. One such plan failed, leading to a 5-year prison sentence for robbery. By then, the marriage was effectively over in practice, though not in name. Thornton remained incarcerated when news reached him that Bonnie had died alongside Clyde Barrow. Notably, Bonnie was still wearing her wedding ring at the time of her death, a detail that has intrigued historians and biographers alike. Formal divorce proceedings were never completed, in part because Bonnie's later life made such legal matters impossible to resolve. Her brief marriage offers a revealing glimpse into the limited options available to young women of her background during the era. It also underscores how early hardship, difficult choices, and unstable relationships shaped Bonnie Parker, long before she became a figure of national notoriety. Bonnie didn't smoke cigars. One of the most widely circulated images of Bonnie Parker shows her posing confidently with a pistol, one foot resting on the bumper of a Ford Motor Company automobile, a cigar held in her mouth in a style reminiscent of Edward G. Robinson in Little Caesar. The image has become iconic, but it was never intended as a serious statement. It was part of a playful series of staged photographs created purely for Bonnie and Clyde's own amusement. These images were discovered later on undeveloped film that had been left behind at one of the group's temporary hideouts in Missouri. The collection reveals a deliberately exaggerated, almost theatrical tone. In one photograph, Bonnie pretends to aim a rifle at Clyde Barrow as he smiles and raises his hands in mock surrender. Another shows Clyde dramatically kissing Bonnie in a manner clearly inspired by Hollywood romance. Along with these photographs, several of Bonnie's poems were also recovered at the same location. Together, the images and writings played a major role in transforming the pair into national figures. Newspapers across the United States eagerly reprinted the cigar photograph, helping to cement a striking and memorable public image. Historical evidence, however, suggests that this image was largely performative. Bonnie was not known to regularly smoke cigars. Like Clyde, she appears to have preferred cigarettes, with Camel cigarettes often mentioned in contemporary accounts. The enduring image of Bonnie as a cigar-smoking outlaw was more a product of visual storytelling than everyday reality. That said, eyewitness recollections from the period indicate that Bonnie did enjoy drinking whiskey, and several people later recalled seeing her intoxicated. Clyde, by contrast, tended to avoid alcohol, believing it was important to remain clear-headed and ready to move quickly if circumstances required. This contrast further illustrates how carefully staged moments came to overshadow the more ordinary details of their daily lives. Bonnie and Clyde both had trouble walking. After being convicted on multiple charges related to automobile theft, store robberies, and a prison escape, Clyde Barrow was sentenced in 1930 to 14 years at Easton Prison Farm, a Texas institution known for its punishing labor system and severe conditions. Clyde ultimately served only about 17 months of that sentence. His early release was largely the result of persistent appeals by his mother, whose efforts eventually persuaded Texas authorities to grant him parole. Although his time at Easton was relatively brief, it left permanent marks on his life. Historical evidence indicates that Clyde endured extreme deprivation and mistreatment during his incarceration. The exhausting work details, lack of adequate care, and unsafe environment took a heavy toll. These experiences profoundly shaped his outlook and fueled a deep determination never to return to the Texas prison system. At one point, desperate to escape the most grueling labor assignments, Clyde made a drastic decision that resulted in the loss of 2 toes on his left foot. Unaware that his mother's appeal was about to succeed, he carried out this act just days before his parole was approved. The injury permanently affected his balance and left him with a noticeable limp for the rest of his life. He later found it easier to drive without shoes, as wearing them made it difficult for him to control the pedals. By the summer of 1933, Clyde was still driving in this manner when a serious accident occurred that would permanently affect Bonnie Parker. Known for his fast and careless driving, Clyde failed to notice a road detour at a construction site and veered off course, sending the car into a dry riverbed. During the crash, the vehicle's battery was damaged, releasing acid that severely injured Bonnie's right leg. She was taken to a nearby farmhouse where quick action using common household remedies helped limit the damage. Despite this, the injury never healed properly. Because the pair could not safely seek professional medical care, Bonnie's recovery was incomplete. Though her condition gradually stabilized, her mobility was permanently reduced. Contemporary witnesses later recalled that during the final year of her life, Bonnie often struggled to walk and frequently relied on Clyde to help her move from place to place. Bonnie and Clyde were unwilling killers. Life on the run left Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow in a constant state of tension. They were always aware that anyone, a passerby, a shopkeeper, or a neighbor, might recognize them and alert authorities. Each encounter carried the risk of confrontation, making it nearly impossible for the pair to ever feel secure or settled. When faced with the possibility of being captured, Clyde was especially determined to avoid a return to prison, an institution he deeply feared after earlier experiences. Historical records show that encounters with law enforcement during this period often escalated quickly once the group felt cornered. Over the course of their time together, 14 law officers lost their lives in incidents connected to the gang, a fact that would later weigh heavily on public opinion. It is also documented that Clyde sometimes sought alternatives to direct confrontation. On several occasions, individuals, including law officers, were briefly detained to allow the group to escape. These people were later released unharmed, and in more than one instance, Clyde reportedly gave them money to help them return home. Such actions, while illegal, reflected his preference to flee rather than engage whenever circumstances allowed. Public sympathy for Bonnie and Clyde shifted dramatically after events that took place on Easter Sunday in 1934 near Grapevine. That morning, Bonnie Clyde and Henry Methvin were resting in their car when they were approached by two motorcycle officers who believed they had encountered a suspicious vehicle. Accounts from the period suggest that confusion unfolded rapidly. Clyde reportedly suggested taking the officers to facilitate an escape, but the situation escalated before any such plan could be carried out. Patrolman Edward Brian Wheeler was fatally wounded, and shortly afterward, Holloway Daniel Murphy, a young officer on his first day of duty, also lost his life. Murphy was engaged to be married, and his fiancée later attended his funeral wearing her wedding dress, a detail widely reported in the press. These events marked a turning point. Newspapers across the country carried the story, and the tone of coverage changed sharply. The same public that had once viewed Bonnie and Clyde as daring and rebellious now saw them as a serious danger. From that point forward, popular sentiment hardened, and many Americans demanded that their flight from justice be brought to an end, by whatever means necessary. Bonnie and Clyde were difficult to embalm, and they knew their embalmer. The lives of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow came to an abrupt end during a coordinated law enforcement operation carried out by officers from Texas and Louisiana. The event took place along a rural road in Louisiana, where the couple stopped after believing they were helping with what appeared to be a disabled truck connected to Henry Methvin's family. Unbeknownst to them, the situation had been staged. Once Clyde brought the car to a halt, officers hidden nearby immediately acted. The encounter was swift and decisive, leaving the vehicle heavily damaged and bringing their time on the run to a final close. Leading the operation was Frank Hamer, a veteran Texas Ranger who had tracked the pair for months. Determined to ensure there was no possibility of escape, officers approached the vehicle only after the scene was secure. Contemporary reports described the moment as one of overwhelming finality. Official records from the coroner documented extensive injuries sustained by both Bonnie and Clyde, listing 17 entry wounds on Clyde and 26 on Bonnie, with later accounts suggesting the true numbers may have been higher. The sheer extent of the damage became evident during preparations for burial. The responsibility for preparing the bodies fell to Undertaker C.B. Bailey, who later remarked on the extraordinary difficulty of his task due to the condition of the remains. Assisting him was Dillard Darby, a man whose path had crossed with Bonnie and Clyde under very different circumstances just a year earlier. Darby had previously been detained by the Barrow gang after they took his car, an encounter that ended without lasting harm. During that earlier meeting, Bonnie reportedly found it darkly amusing that Darby was an undertaker and jokingly suggested he might one day care for them professionally. When they released him, they even gave him a small sum of money for his trouble. Bonnie liked to write poetry. As a student, Bonnie Parker showed a clear creative streak. She enjoyed inventing songs and short stories, and poetry quickly became one of her favorite forms of expression. Writing offered her a way to shape emotions and experiences into something lasting, a habit that stayed with her into adulthood. After joining Clyde Barrow on the road, Bonnie found herself surrounded by new and intense experiences, which soon became the raw material for her writing. During a brief period of incarceration in April 1932, she composed 10 poems that she later grouped under the title Poetry from Life's Other Side. These works focused on the lives of people operating outside the law and, in particular, on the women who endured hardship because of their loyalty to men who failed them. One of the most notable poems from this group, The Story of Suicide Sal, tells of a woman who follows a criminal partner only to be abandoned and forgotten. The poem expresses a painful mix of devotion, regret, and longing, revealing Bonnie's ability to articulate emotional conflict with surprising clarity and restraint. Bonnie continued writing as the Barrow gang situation became increasingly unstable. One of her final poems, The End of the Line, was written shortly before her death and stands out for its striking realism. Unlike earlier romantic portrayals, this piece shows a clear-eyed understanding of her circumstances and acknowledges that their choices had consequences they could not escape. Rather than denial or bravado, the poem conveys acceptance and a somber sense of inevitability. History followed a different course than Bonnie had imagined in her verse. Although she wrote of being laid to rest beside Clyde, the two were ultimately buried in separate locations. Even so, their connection remained central to how the public remembered them. Bonnie's gravestone bears a gentle, sentimental epitaph about bringing brightness into the world, reflecting how her family wished her to be remembered. Clyde's marker, by contrast, carries a short and direct inscription, Gone but not forgotten. Together, the inscriptions underscore the contrast between myth and reality, and between the lives they lived and the words they left behind. Bonnie and Clyde were devoted to their families. Unlike many figures operating outside the law during the same era, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were not isolated individuals relying solely on each other or a small circle of associates. Both came from close-knit families who remained loyal to them even during the most difficult periods of their lives. Maintaining contact with relatives was a priority, and they made considerable effort to stay connected and offer support whenever possible. Throughout their time on the run, Bonnie and Clyde returned repeatedly to the West Dallas area, where most of their family members lived. These visits were frequent, sometimes occurring several times within a single month. Clyde developed a cautious but effective method of communication. He would drive past his parents' home at speed and toss a bottle containing a handwritten note from the car. His parents would retrieve it later and follow the directions inside, which specified a safe meeting place outside the city. Although relations between the families were strained at first, Bonnie's mother initially blamed Clyde for the direction her daughter's life had taken. Practical necessity eventually encouraged cooperation. Over time, the families learned to communicate discreetly, using coded language during phone calls and carefully arranged meetings to avoid drawing attention. When Bonnie and Clyde had money, they shared it with their families. During leaner periods, especially when they were exhausted or unwell, their relatives provided clean clothing, meals, and small amounts of cash. Clyde, in particular, remained deeply devoted to his parents. At the time of his death, he was reportedly attempting to purchase land in Louisiana so they would have a more secure future. This ongoing assistance did not go unnoticed by authorities. Several members of the Barrow family eventually served short jail sentences for helping their well-known relatives. Ironically, the strong family ties that sustained Bonnie and Clyde also contributed to their downfall. A similar sense of family loyalty appeared in Henry Methvin, a member of the Barrow gang. Seeing this as a sign of shared values, Bonnie and Clyde went out of their way to ensure Henry could visit his own family regularly. What they did not realize was that Henry and his father were quietly negotiating with law enforcement. In exchange for leniency, Henry's father provided the information about Bonnie and Clyde's movements. It was during a trip intended to reconnect with Henry at his father's home that authorities were able to intercept Bonnie and Clyde, bringing their time on the run to an end. When the legend is stripped away, the story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow looks far less glamorous than pop culture suggests. Their lives were not defined by romance or rebellion, but by constant pressure, physical hardship, fractured dreams, and consequences that followed every decision they made. Do you believe Bonnie and Clyde have been over-romanticized, or do their lives still deserve sympathy despite the facts? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. Enjoy deep dives into real American crime history and Old West myths versus reality. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps keep these true histories alive and honest.